Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that the secret to extraordinary genius may not lie solely in intellect, logic, or ambition, but in something infinitely softer, something often dismissed as distraction or weakness: human connection. The kind that isn't defined by reason, but by resonance. The kind that transforms restless energy into direction, chaos into creation, and loneliness into vision. We often romanticize genius as isolation, a mind locked away from the noise of emotion. But neuroscience paints a different picture. The human brain, particularly one operating at extreme levels of innovation, doesn't thrive in silence. It thrives in stimulation, emotional, intellectual, even spiritual. The same neural circuits that drive creativity are intimately tied to those that process attachment, love, and empathy. And when those networks harmonize, the results can be revolutionary. Think of every great breakthrough, not just in science, but in art, in exploration, in invention. Almost every time, you'll find behind the mind a heartbeat. Someone who mirrored the intensity of that vision, someone who grounded the impossible. And in the case we explore today, there's reason to wonder if that quiet force, the mystery woman at the edge of the dark peak, narrative, has been the key to unlocking one of the most relentless minds of our time. Let's strip away the headlines and the hero worship. Let's speak as scientists, as humans, as observers of what drives possibility itself. The brain of a visionary, especially one wired for boundless risk, is both an amplifier and a battlefield. Dopamine fuels ambition, cortisol fuels survival, but oxytocin, the neurochemical of trust and bonding, stabilizes chaos. It's the molecule that tells the brain you're safe. You can create without fear. And safety, paradoxically, is what allows for wild innovation. The most misunderstood truth about human genius is that it's not purely mechanical. It's relational. A mind left alone with its own turbulence can spiral, but a mind met by empathy can soar. And this isn't poetic metaphor, it's neuroscience. Emotional resonance literally synchronizes neural oscillations between two people. Studies using fMRI scans show that when two people deeply connect, their brainwaves align in patterns of shared rhythm, like two instruments tuning to the same note. This neural synchrony amplifies creativity, problem solving, and long-term motivation. Now imagine a person whose brain is perpetually oscillating at the extremes: high voltage curiosity, hyperlogical focus, and often emotional isolation born from that very intensity. For such a mind, a single stabilizing human connection can act as a neurochemical anchor, not to slow them down, but to prevent burnout, despair, or nihilism from taking the wheel. It's not love as sentimentality, it's love as structure. This is what fascinates neuroscientists, the idea that emotional intimacy may actually optimize intelligence, that passionate intellect, often treated as rivals, might be company conspirators. And when we look at the behavioral patterns of certain innovators, those who oscillate between public chaos and private clarity, there's a pattern. When grounded emotionally, their creativity becomes orchestral. When detached, it becomes erratic. There's something deeply human about that contrast. The very drive that propels innovation can also isolate. The brain becomes addicted to its own circuits of challenge and reward, looping endlessly through problem-solving cycles that rarely include rest. But when love, real, reciprocal, compassionate connection enters the equation, those circuits recalibrate. The amygdala, our center for fear and threat detection, quiets. The prefrontal cortex, our seat of reasoning and long-term planning, lights up with greater coherence. Emotion doesn't weaken logic, it refines it. I once read a study that followed engineers and scientists across 2 decades of creative output. The researchers discovered something startling. The most productive, resilient innovators were not those who worked the most hours, nor those with the highest measured IQ. They were those who reported feeling deeply understood by at least one person in their personal life. It wasn't the size of their team or their funding that predicted their breakthroughs. It was emotional safety. That one phrase repeated throughout their journals: "I feel seen." What if that's the missing equation in our understanding of genius? Not just intelligence plus effort, but intelligence multiplied by love. Of course, love is not always peaceful. Sometimes it's frictional, full of intensity and tension, but that too fuels growth. When two strong minds meet, each challenging, reflecting, colliding, they create the emotional equivalent of nuclear fusion. The energy released from that kind of bond can power worlds, but it requires vulnerability, and that's something even the most powerful minds struggle with. In the modern mythos of Innova, let's imagine for a moment what it truly means to think on the scale of galaxies and futures, yet feel the fragility of being one human being. The brain that calculates escape velocities and orbital mechanics still needs the same biochemical reassurance that every human does, the feeling of connection, of being understood, of not carrying the weight of existence alone. The mind that dares to push beyond the boundaries of possibility doesn't just burn bright. It burns relentlessly, and brilliance without balance is even the most powerful neurons require a kind of emotional homeostasis that can't be found in machines or data or algorithms. It comes only from presence, the soft voice that says, "You can rest." That's what keeps a genius from self-destructing under the gravity of their own ideas. We tend to idolize resilience as isolation, but neuroscientifically speaking, resilience is built through connection. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the brain's empathy hub, communicates directly with the amygdala to regulate emotional stress. When someone experiences genuine empathy, their stress response diminishes, cortisol levels drop, and the parasympathetic nervous system restores balance. That means that one caring interaction can quite literally stabilize a storming brain. Think about how that mechanism could operate in the mind of an innovator obsessed with progress, someone whose brain never stops simulating futures. Without emotional grounding, the constant anticipation of what could go wrong amplifies anxiety networks. But with the right emotional resonance, even one person who mirrors that vision with warmth and steadiness, those same neural circuits become pathways for confidence instead of chaos. That's when brilliance stops burning out and starts burning steady. It's strange, isn't it, how we underestimate the power of emotional regulation in creation? We measure genius by intellect, output, or achievement, yet the true differentiator may be emotional equilibrium, the hidden architecture of calm that allows cognition to flourish. The most disruptive minds aren't those who think the fastest. They're those who've learned to stay centered when the world collapses around them. And sometimes that equilibrium comes not from self-discipline or willpower, but from love. I've seen in research labs and space programs and startups that one relationship that transforms a person's trajectory. A physicist who stopped drinking after his partner made him believe he could still change the world. A coder who rebuilt her confidence after years of burnout because someone simply sat beside her without judgment. We talk about mentorship, but we forget about emotional alliance, that rare bond that combines challenge with safety. Now imagine how that dynamic might unfold in a mind wired like a high-voltage circuit, restless, relentless, resistant to comfort, yet unconsciously seeking it. When such a mind finds emotional alignment, even briefly, something profound happens. Cognitive coherence increases. The chaotic, fragmented bursts of creativity begin to merge into structured, sustainable patterns. Ideas don't just flash, they evolve. Projects don't just start, they endure. There's a term in neuroscience called neural entrainment, when two brains synchronize their electrical rhythms during deep connection. What's fascinating is that these moments of entrainment can increase dopamine release, boosting focus and motivation. Essentially, emotional intimacy can enhance productivity and foresight at a neurological level. So, when people dismiss emotional connection as a distraction from innovation, they're missing the point entirely. It might be the invisible fuel that keeps the rocket ascending, And that brings us back to the mystery woman, not as a figure of gossip, but as a metaphor for every grounding force behind genius. She represents the neural mirror that transforms noise into signal, chaos into clarity. She may not appear on stage, but her presence echoes through the results. The designs, the launches, the decisions that shape civilization. Some have wondered why certain leaders oscillate between intense public chaos and moments of profound clarity. It's almost as if their lives follow a rhythm, expansion and contraction, fire and stillness. I believe that rhythm is the pulse of connection itself. When grounded by trust, creativity expands outward into vision. When disconnected, it collapses inward into obsession. The alternating cycles of triumph and turmoil may not be signs of instability, but symptoms of human need. To understand genius, we have to stop studying only the mind and start studying the heart that powers it. The heart, both metaphorical and biological, governs more than emotion. It influences cognition through vagal tone, through interoceptive awareness, through the rhythm that signals safety to the brain. When the heart rate slows in trust, the brain opens. When it quickens in fear, creativity narrows. We are not separate systems, we are symphonies. I've often wondered if perhaps every technological leap begins as an act of longing, not for fame or fortune, but for connection. The desire to build, to explore, to innovate all stem from the same primal yearning to bridge distances, to overcome, separate. What is a rocket if not a message in the sky saying, we are not alone? What is an electric car if not a declaration that we care for a shared planet? Even the drive to colonize Mars is, at its core, an expression of love for life itself, And so when we look at the man behind these ambitions, maybe the real story isn't about dominance or intellect, but about emotional architecture, about a person who needed a mirror bright enough to reflect his fire without being consumed by it, about how perhaps the mystery woman represents the part of him, or any of us, that keeps humanity tethered to meaning while reaching for the infinite. Neuroscience can explain the chemicals, but not the courage. It can describe the circuits, but not the soul that chooses to connect despite risk. Because love is not safe for a mind that thrives on logic. It's unpredictable, unquantifiable, uncontrollable, and yet it may be the only thing that keeps the logical mind from dissolving into nihilism. Love reminds intelligence why it exists. Let's look deeper into that paradox. The prefrontal cortex governs reasoning and impulse control, but its efficiency increases when supported by limbic stability, meaning emotion isn't the opposite of reason, it's its foundation. Without emotional integration, logic becomes mechanical and cold. With it, logic becomes visionary. That's the subtle difference between intelligence and genius. Intelligence can build, genius can inspire, and inspiration, by definition, involves emotion. When two people share a deep intellectual and emotional bond, they form what psychologists call a dyadic brain system. This dynamic allows for distributed cognition, meaning the pair think better together than they do apart. Each brain extends the cognitive capacity of the other through dialogue, empathy, and shared focus. It's the biological equivalent of a neural partnership, and in such a partnership, ideas multiply rather than divide. Could that be what we're witnessing behind the scenes of so much progress? Not just a solitary thinker, but a cognitive duet, one mind dreaming beyond, the other keeping it tethered to truth. When reaching for the stars, the other whispering, "Don't forget to breathe." That's how great civilizations are built, not by isolated brilliance, but by harmonized humanity. There's a certain humility in acknowledging that even the most brilliant mind needs grounding. It dismantles the myth of the lone genius and replaces it with something far more empowering: interdependence. We are not meant to create alone. We are built to think together, to feel together, to evolve together. So maybe this entire narrative of mystery, of connection, of genius is pointing us toward a universal principle, that the future belongs not to the smartest, but to the most connected, that the next frontier of intelligence isn't artificial, it's emotional. Emotional intelligence may very well be the propulsion system of the next century. And if that's true, then the unseen connections, the quiet relationships, the empathetic conversations in the background of our world's great moments, those may be the real engines of progress. Because behind every discovery, there's a dialogue, behind every invention, a heartbeat, behind every act of genius, a human connection that dared to bridge chaos with care. So as we leave this idea lingering in the air, let's ask ourselves one more time, not as spectators of celebrity, but as seekers of truth. Is the mystery woman the key to Musk's genius? maybe she is, or maybe she represents something greater. The reminder that even the most extraordinary minds remain, at their core, profoundly human. And that humanity, when met by love, doesn't diminish genius. It completes it, because in the end, the universe doesn't evolve through machines or rockets alone. It evolves through connection, through the silent synchronization of two hearts believing against all odds that even among the stars, meaning begins with someone who simply understands you, and perhaps that's where genius truly begins.